Let's open to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16. We read this on Sunday, and I teased a little bit of where we were going, and I wanted to just remind you of this, because this is where we're going to begin tonight. Oh. Takes the elbow grease to get that. Okay. All right, so in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 13, Jesus presents the question to his disciples. What are people saying about me? Who do people say that I am? And there were various answers that were given, but one of those that's pertinent to our class this quarter is, some people say you're Jeremiah. And we talked about, why did they give that answer? What did they see in Jesus that made them think, maybe he's Jeremiah? Jeremiah who has come back from the dead or something like that. They clearly associated Jesus with Jeremiah. And so we talked on Sunday very briefly about some of those qualities that Jeremiah possessed, that Jesus himself also possessed, and why those parallels would have been drawn. But I told you then that tonight we were going to delve into that even more. And so I want to consider that with you tonight, some of the similarities between Jeremiah and Jesus. And I'm going to share with you 10 or 11 of the, 11. But there's several more than these. This is just kind of a selected list that I came up with. Well, I didn't come up with it. I found it in some of my reading. So let's talk about some of these. Here's one parallel that existed, and that is that their historical settings were very similar. Jerusalem was about to fall when Jeremiah was preaching. And there was that fact was also true when Jesus was preaching. He talked about how the temple was going to fall at the hands of the Romans. When Jeremiah was preaching, the religion of the Jews was just buried in this ceremonial formalism and very rigid. It was kind of a go through the motions kind of a thing. And there was a greater need for spirituality in the lives of the Jews in Jeremiah's day, and that was certainly true during the time of Christ as well. So their historical settings were similar. Both of them had a message not only for God's people Israel, but also for the world. The last several chapters of Jeremiah, he speaks to foreign Gentile nations. He has a message for them. It's not just the nation of Judah. And of course, Jesus has a message that is for all of the world as well. Both of them came from a high tradition. We talked some about Jeremiah's background last Sunday. We talked about his lineage. We talked about the fact that he was the son of a priest. Okay, so he comes from this priest, prophetic background with God calling him into prophetic ministry. Jesus is, of course, divine. He's a king. He's a priest. He's a prophet. So they both come from this very high kind of tradition. Both of them condemned the commercialism of temple worship. You remember Jesus going in and casting out the money changers in the temple. You can read about that in John chapter 2 first. It seems he did it on two different occasions. First in John 2, but then you can also read about it in Matthew chapter 21 as Jesus is in the final week of his life. You will not turn my Father's house into a den of robbers. You may remember Jesus saying that. Well, that comes from Jeremiah chapter 7. Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 7 and Jeremiah 26, stood in the gates of the temple and he prophesied to the nation about their empty spiritual lives, and he condemned their emphasis on the commercial and merchandise. Both of them were accused of political treason. They were both tried, persecuted, and imprisoned because of the things that they said and the things that they did. Jeremiah was, as Jesus was, wrongfully accused. Things were said about him that were blatantly false and lies. And of course, that happened to Jesus as well. This is connected back to the first point, but both of them foretold the destruction of the temple. That temple sermon that Jeremiah preached in chapter 7 and verse 14, he talked about how the temple was soon to be overthrown. And Jesus said in Mark chapter 13, in Matthew 24, and in Luke 21, when the disciples said, "Teacher, look at the great stones that comprise this structure." And he said, in your lifetime, it's going to happen that not one stone will be left upon another. All of these stones are going to be cast down. Jeremiah, of course, was prophesying of the Babylonian destruction of the temple, and Jesus prophesying of the Roman destruction in AD 70. Both of them wept over Jerusalem. I mentioned this on Sunday. Jeremiah 9 and verse 1, he says, "Oh, that my head were a fountain of waters, and that my eyes were flowing, an ever-flowing stream of tears." And Jesus in Luke 19 and verse 41 was weeping over Jerusalem and her lack of repentance. Both of them were rejected by their own families. Jeremiah chapter 12 and verse 6 mentions that not only the people of his hometown, but even Jeremiah's own family was not believing in him, and they were pushing back against him, even to a point of joining in plots against him. John chapter 7, about Jesus in verse 5, explicitly says his own brothers did not believe in him. And that's talking about his flesh and blood family, his brothers. John chapter 1 and verse 11 is not talking exclusively about Jesus' flesh and blood. You may remember that passage where John says that he came to his own and his own did not receive him. Okay, well, that's talking really about humanity at large. But that certainly in John 7 and verse 5 includes his own immediate family. Both of them were very tender-hearted in their ministry. Jeremiah, we talked about that on Sunday. But Jeremiah was so much like, this is interesting. Think about Isaiah 53. You remember that language. He is a man of sorrows. He's acquainted with grief. Okay? The rabbis often associated Jeremiah with the man of Isaiah 53. They thought it was Jeremiah. A lot of them did. Why is that? Well, because he was so much like this man of sorrows and this suffering servant that Isaiah wrote about. Now, of course, we know from New Testament revelation who that person was. We know from Matthew 8 and Acts chapter 8. Matthew and Luke tell us that Isaiah was talking about Jesus. But it is interesting that the rabbis thought that. Both of them knew feelings of loneliness and isolation. Isaiah chapter 53, that same text, talks about how this suffering servant was not well received and not taken in, and that everyone was standing far off. And in Isaiah chapter 53, I'm drawing a blank on the exact language, so let me just turn to it. And chapter 53 and verse 3, despised and forsaken of men. Yeah, I was thinking about the second line, not the first. He was despised and forsaken of men. Jeremiah repeatedly spoke of, man, it's just me. I'm all alone. Nobody else is supporting me. And the last thing is, both of these men enjoyed unusual fellowship with God. And by unusual, all I mean by that is that they had a deep and intimate kind of connection with God that other people, it seems, did not share in. Jeremiah spoke with God very freely and candidly in his prayers and in his conversations. And Jesus certainly did that as well. That's just 11 things. There's more. In fact, the list that I pulled these from was a list of 16, but I've seen even longer lists of similarities between Jeremiah and Jesus. So when you look at some of these things, it's not a difficult jump to see why in Matthew chapter 16 the people said, maybe he's Jeremiah, right? They would have known these things about Jeremiah, and they saw these same things in Jesus. All right. I know that was a lot. I actually have some other things I want to get to tonight, so I kind of rushed through that. Do you have any comments or, Brittany, observations?
Well, why would people, was there some sort of promise that those individuals would be resurrected?
No, it's a great question. No, you do have Old Testament prophecies that talk about the return or the coming of Elijah, right? And so there was kind of this idea that Elijah might come back from the dead. Elijah, the first great prophet of Israel, he might come back. So maybe there was something like that, but I don't know of any Old Testament passage about Jeremiah or after Jeremiah that indicates he's going to come back. I don't know of one. Maybe somebody else does. Anything else about this list? Again, I know that was quick. Okay. Once you go to Jeremiah chapter 40, I want to show you something else about the man Jeremiah. Something else that I think is really interesting. Jeremiah chapter 40. I'll tell you what, let's go back to chapter 39 and let's get the broader context. Chapter 39, verse 1. When Jerusalem was captured in the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. All right, so this is discussing the end of the city, the fall of the city. Now look at verse 11. Now Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, gave orders about Jeremiah through Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard, saying, "Take him and look after him, and do nothing harmful to him, but rather deal with him just as he tells you." Is anything about that interesting to you? Or strange?
Does Nebuchadnezzar remember this prophet by name?
Yes. Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man in the world, knows who Jeremiah is. He knows him by name. And not only does he know who he is, but he says to his captain, "Don't hurt him." Now, this is really bizarre. Why would Nebuchadnezzar give these orders about Jeremiah? Any idea? What do you think, Alan?
God.
Okay, so God is looking out for Jeremiah. Yeah, that's certainly a part of it. Has Jeremiah done anything that would maybe cause him to gain King Nebuchadnezzar's favor? Now, we haven't talked about it in class yet, but the answer to that is yes. Throughout the book, and we'll see this as we go, Jeremiah repeatedly says to the different kings of Judah. Remember, there's several kings. There's like 5 of them that his life and ministry spans. He says to them again and again, Babylon is coming. Submit to Babylon. Don't resist. Don't try to fight back. Remember the earlier slide, or this slide, it talks about both of them were accused of political treason. The Jews hated Jeremiah when he was saying things like, don't try to fight back against Babylon. You just need to surrender. You need to give in. If you will surrender to Babylon and just take whatever it is that they're bringing, your life will be better. If you resist, you're going to die. If you don't resist, at least you'll get to keep your life. You may go to captivity, but at least you'll get to live, right? So Jeremiah is saying, just give Nebuchadnezzar what he wants. Don't fight back. Nebuchadnezzar must have heard about this. This man on the inside who's convincing or trying to convince the people to do what I want them to do. So Nebuchadnezzar must know about what Jeremiah has been preaching and how much people don't like this message of, well, just surrender and let Babylon do what they want to do. But Nebuchadnezzar apparently knows about this, and so he says, hey, don't kill that guy. We could use him on our side. It sounds like he's on our side already. Now, of course, Jeremiah is not committing treason. He's simply telling the people what God is telling him to say. But it sounds like treasonous language. But not to Nebuchadnezzar. He appreciates it. Al?
It's not unreasonable to suspect that Nebuchadnezzar is going to send spies ahead. Joshua did that.
Sure.
Moses did, sent spies, and they would report back to Nebuchadnezzar what they are hearing and seeing in Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's a good point. And let's add this too. These are some dates that I want you to keep in mind. All of these, of course, are BC. 605, this is the first of the 3 Babylonian campaigns against Judah. This is the one where Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were carried off into captivity. You can read about this in Daniel chapter 1. That happened in 605. Nebuchadnezzar led the charge. In 597, Nebuchadnezzar came back in a second campaign against Judah. This is the one where Ezekiel was carried off into captivity. You can read about that in Ezekiel chapter 1. The one that we're reading about here is this one, this last one, 586. So for the better part of 20 years, Nebuchadnezzar has known very well the details of what's going on in Jerusalem. Surely he's heard about Jeremiah in this time, because Jeremiah started preaching when? 627, right? Jeremiah has been preaching surrender to Babylon for a long time. Surely Nebuchadnezzar knows about that. So when you come to chapter 40 of Jeremiah 39, the word which came to Jeremiah, verse 1, from the Lord, after Nebuzaradan, captain of the bodyguard, had released him from Ramah, when he had taken him bound in chains among all the exiles of Jerusalem and Judah who were being exiled to Babylon. The city of Ramah is where the Jews were taken from Jerusalem in shackles. They were taken to Ramah as kind of a holding area to get them ready for Babylonian exile. It's a long journey. It's going to be a very difficult and arduous journey. The Babylonians are getting them ready and waiting for the right time to carry them back to Babylon. So they've got this exile that's coming. But as all the people are waiting in Ramah, Nebuzaradan comes and says, all right, Jeremiah, you're going to come with me. So look at verse 2. The captain of the bodyguard had taken Jeremiah and said to him, the Lord your God promised this calamity against this place. Now, how would he know that? How would Nebuzaradan, don't you just love hearing that? That's a cool name, right? How in the world would he know what God said about Jerusalem? He's quoting Jeremiah. Yeah, he knows what Jeremiah's been preaching. The Lord your God promised this calamity. And the Lord, verse 3, has brought it and done just as he promised. Because you people sinned against the Lord and did not listen to his voice, therefore this thing has happened to you. Boy, he sure sounds like an Israelite prophet. He knows what's happened. And he knows why it's happened. So now verse 4. But now, behold, I am freeing you today from the chains which are on your hands. If you would prefer to come with me to Babylon, come along, and I will look after you. But if you would prefer not to come with me to Babylon, never mind. Look, the whole land is before you. Go wherever it seems good and right for you to go. As Jeremiah was still not going back, he said, go on back then to Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, whom the king of Babylon has appointed over the cities of Judah, and stay with him among the people. Or else go anywhere it seems right for you to go. So the captain of the bodyguard gave him a ration and a gift and let him go. Wow. I mean, this is incredible. Jeremiah is getting this amazing treatment from this pagan Gentile who is a bloodthirsty, leader in this military. But remember, what did God say to Jeremiah in chapter 1 when he called him? Now gird up your loins and arise and speak to the people all which I command you. Do not be dismayed before them, or I will dismay you before them. Now behold, I have made you today as a fortified city, and as a pillar of iron and walls of bronze against the whole land, to the kings of Judah, its princes, to its priests, and to the people of the land. They will fight against you, but they will not overcome you, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. Jeremiah, I'm with you. I'm by your side all the way through. I will make sure that you are delivered. This is God fulfilling his promise. He promised to be with Jeremiah throughout his ministry way back in 627. And here we are in 586. Everything's been wiped out. People are about to be carried off into Babylonian captivity. They've got shackles on their arms and legs. And God says, not Jeremiah. I'm going to take care of him, just as he promised to do. All right. Before we move on, anything about that? Alan?
I absolutely believe what you said, but there's also a viewpoint from that one to keep Jeremiah either in Jerusalem, still preaching the same thing, submit, don't rebel, don't be a problem, or go to, with the exiles into captivity where the message would be likely the same, submit, don't be a problem in Babylon.
Sure.
So either way he goes is a benefit to Babylon.
Yeah, that's right. And Jeremiah at this point is an old man. It's not like he's going to start an insurrection and try to form some army, right? He's an old gray-headed man who's very weak. You're not weak, Alan. You might be an older gray-headed man, but you're not weak. I've seen you operate a hand truck. We're going to have more to say at the end of the quarter about what happened after the destruction of the city, because there's a lot more to the story. Jeremiah's story doesn't end with the fall of Jerusalem, but that's a future lesson. Okay, now the next lesson that you're going to need, lesson number 3, is over here on the table, so you can pick that up for Sunday. But I'm going to start with a little bit of extra stuff that's not on the sheet, okay? So you weren't expected to prepare for any of this or anything. I forgot I made that slide. That's just a slide about everything I just talked about, okay? All right. Our next lesson is on the historical and political setting of what's going on in Judah, and obviously we've talked about some of that already with Babylon, but we need to set the stage a little bit more and understand what's going on with Jeremiah when his ministry begins. And specifically, I want to talk about King Josiah. So I want you to turn with me to 2 Kings chapter 23, and let's talk about Josiah's grandfather first. Anybody know who his grandfather was? All right, Manasseh. What do we know about Manasseh? I'm sorry? He was bad. That's an understatement, right? Manasseh is arguably the worst king that Judah ever had. What are some of the things that are said about Manasseh? Does anybody remember? I mean, pretty much anything bad you can think of that the scripture ever says anywhere was said about Manasseh. But there were a few things in particular that were said about him that were just horrid.
What is the 2 Kings reference?
I'm sorry, 2 Kings 23. 2 Kings 23. I think the most despicable thing about Manasseh is that, and when I say this, you'll be like, oh yeah, right, that was him. It says of him that he burned his children in the fire. He offered up his own children as human sacrifices to pagan gods. 2 Kings chapter 23, I'm sorry, some of y'all are looking like, wait a minute, that's not in 23. This is what's in 2 Kings 23 that I wanted you to see. 23, did I type that wrong? No, here, no. I didn't type it wrong, I looked at it wrong, my eyes deceived me. I was looking at 23.
Been hanging around Biden too much?
What'd you say?
Been hanging around Biden too much?
Yeah, that's it. I was looking at verses 36 and 37. My notes clearly say 26 and 27. I don't know what I was doing there. Look at 26. However, the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, which his anger burned against Judah, because of all the provocation with which Manasseh had provoked him. Manasseh's life is recorded back in chapter 21, and all of his evil things that he did, including burning his own children in the fire, offering them as human sacrifices. But he led the whole nation into further idolatry and just depths of depravity that were unknown before him. And he had a nice long rule, 55 years. Now, to his credit, you may remember at the end of his rule, he was carried off into captivity and he repented. And he prayed to God that God would forgive him, and God gave him his kingdom back. Took him back to Jerusalem, and he became a godly man at the end of his life, which is great. The problem was the damage that he had done was so great it couldn't be overcome. So Manasseh ruled for 55 years. After he died, who became the king next? Ammon, his son. He didn't rule for very long. 2 years. He was evil like his father. He was 22 years old when he became king. Ammon, 2 Kings 21, verses 19 through 26, tells his story. He's 22 when he became a king, but nobody liked him. And at the end of 2 years, he was assassinated by some conspirators. But then the people of the nation didn't like the fact that the conspirators killed Ammon, so the people rose up and killed the conspirators. And when that happened, the next king, Ammon's son, Manasseh's grandson, Josiah. Josiah, one of, if not the greatest king of Judah. But look at his heritage. Coming from a grandfather and a father who were despicable human beings, Josiah is one of the greatest men of the Old Testament. How old is Josiah when he becomes king? 8 years old. 2 Kings 22 and verse 1. 8 years old when he becomes king. His reign begins 640 BC. All right, we're inching closer to these dates, right? We're setting the stage, we're coming closer. He begins his reign at 8 years old at 640. I want you to turn over to the Chronicles record of Josiah's reign. Look at 2 Chronicles 34. The record in Chronicles just has more detail in it. That's the only reason I want you to turn to that one. Chapter 34 and verse 1, he was 8 years old when he became king. He reigned for 31 years in Jerusalem. And verse 2 is the summary of his life. He did right in the sight of the Lord and walked in the ways of his father David and did not turn to the right or to the left. Now, some very important things in Josiah's life begin to happen. Look at verse 3. In the 8th year of his reign, while he was still a youth, he began to seek the God of his father David. All right, 8th year of his reign. So we got to do a little math here. Sandy Cooper, I know you love math. 8th year of his reign, so how old is he? All right, 16 years old, he begins to seek the Lord. This is 632. I'm not going to write BC every time. So now this is 632. At age 16, he begins to take an interest in spiritual things. He becomes very dedicated to this. All right? We continue reading. Verse 3, middle of the verse. In the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the Asherim, the carved images, and the molten images. They tore down the altars, on and on, verse 4 goes, to the point that in verse 5, Josiah burned the bones of the priests on their altars and purged Judah and Jerusalem. Even the priests who were serving these idolatrous worship rites and rituals, he said, exhume their bodies, burn their bones. That's how serious he is about purging the land of idolatry. But when did that happen? 12th year of his reign, so how old is he? All right. All right, 20 years old. All right, 628. 20 years old, 628, 12th year. He begins to purge idolatry. All of this is going on. Judah has this king who is serious about serving God. We're going to turn away from idols. He's going to start promoting the worship of God, and all of this is going on 640 to 628. When does Jeremiah begin his ministry? You think Jeremiah was aware of all the things that Josiah was doing? Yeah. Josiah and Jeremiah were buds. All right? Of course, Jeremiah is going to be a great supporter of what Josiah is doing. So in the 13th year of Josiah, so when Josiah is 21, that's when Jeremiah begins preaching. Jeremiah and Josiah are probably about the same age. We talked about that Sunday, right? He was called when he was a young man. We don't know exactly how old he was. People think he was anywhere from 15 to 30. But they were contemporaries and pretty close ones, okay? All right. I know y'all love dates. I know this is hard to follow. Last one. All right, look at verse 8. In the 18th year of his reign, when he had purged the land and the house, he sent Shaphan, the son of Azaliah, and Maaseiah, the official of the city, and Joah, the son of okay, all right. They're going to repair the temple. That's what they're going to do, verse 8 says. They're going to repair the temple. I want you to notice a couple of things about verse 8. First of all, it says his 18th year, which that would be 26 years old. And that would correspond to 622 BC. We are going to restore the temple. We're going to clean it out. It's dirty. It's been run down because nobody's... I mean, it's been at least 57 years since anybody used it, right? So you can imagine the dust and the dirt and how bad of shape that it was in. So Josiah says, all right, it's time to keep this thing going. Let's do all these reforms. Let's purge out the temple and clean it up. You may remember, as they're doing this, what did they discover inside the temple? They found the law, the book of the law of Moses. Notice in verse 8 a name that is mentioned. In the 18th year of his reign, when he had purged the land and the house, he sent Shaphan. I want you to notice that name. Does that name ring a bell to you? Just hold that thought. We'll come back to it. They find the book of the law, all right? They find the book of the law, so you can read about this beginning at verse 14. They were bringing out the money which had been brought into the house of the Lord. Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Lord given by Moses. Hilkiah responded and said to Shaphan the scribe, it's the same one from verse 8, I found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan. Shaphan brought the book to the king and reported further to the king, saying, everything that was entrusted to your servants they are doing. Moreover, verse 18, Shaphan the scribe told the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest gave me a book, and Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. And when the king heard the words of the law, he tore his clothes. All right. Josiah listens. Of course he does. Look at all the things that he's been doing now for 18 years. He wants to know what God says. He's serious about serving God. So when Moses' law is discovered and Shaphan the scribe reads it to him, he sits up, he listens, he mourns, he tears his clothes, and he calls for this national repentance. And chapter 34 talks about the rest of that, as well as the first part of chapter 35. Shaphan. Told you we're going to come back to that, right? Go to Jeremiah 36. You remember talking about this? When the words of Jeremiah that Baruch wrote down were brought before the king, King Jehoiakim, you remember talking about this? All right. 6, verse 10. Baruch read from the book the words of Jeremiah in the house of the Lord in the chamber of Gemariah, the son of Shaphan the scribe. So Shaphan stood before Josiah and read the scripture. His son had that same opportunity in front of Jehoiakim with the words of Jeremiah that Baruch had written. Okay? So there's that scribal lineage there, and Shaphan and his family are a part of this. Now, Josiah is carrying out these reforms at a time of tremendous darkness in the land of Judah, spiritual darkness that's just very great. Josiah comes out as this exceedingly bright light, and he is trying to not only serve God personally, but he wants the whole nation to join him in these reforms. But how did it go? Well, look at Jeremiah chapter 3. Jeremiah chapter 3, look at verse 6. The Lord said to me in the days of Josiah the king, have you seen what faithless Israel did? She went up on every high hill and under every green tree, and she was a harlot there. God's talking about the northern kingdom of Israel. He's not talking about the united. This is divided kingdom time, right? Go back to the kids, right? This is divided kingdom. The northern kingdom of Israel. Have you seen what they did, Jeremiah? Did you see what they did? And he says, I thought, verse 7, after she has done all these things, she will return to me. But she did not return, and her treacherous sister Judah saw it. And I saw that for all the adulteries of faithless Israel, I had sent her away and given her a writ of divorce, yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she went and was a harlot also. Because of the lightness of her harlotry, she polluted the land and committed adultery with stones and trees. Yet in spite of all this, her treacherous sister Judah did not return to me with all her heart, but rather in pretense, declares the Lord. Did the southern kingdom of Judah learn from what happened to Israel in the north? Israel, who got wiped out by the Assyrians, who was carried off into captivity, whose land was devastated. They didn't learn. They should have seen what God did to Israel in the north and said, okay, God's serious about this. We better start doing what he says. But that's not what they did. Ammon, Manasseh, and most of the kings who came before them followed in the same path that all the kings of Israel followed. Not a single good king in the northern kingdom of Israel. All of them were evil. Judah had a few good ones sporadically placed here and there. And God says to Jeremiah, they went and did the same thing, but verse 10 I think is really important. Judah did not return to me with all her heart, but rather in pretense. I think that's a reference to what Josiah tried to do in the nation. Josiah is trying to bring about these great spiritual reforms in the nation, and the people were like, oh, hey, the king called for a Passover. I guess we should do what the king said. That seems to be the attitude that the whole nation took. Josiah was zealous. He was serious about serving God. But everybody else, I mean, it's really hard to get out of this. It's really difficult to change your ways when you've been doing them for so many years. And Josiah could never bring about this true repentance in the nation. He could never get all the people to buy into what he was believing himself. And all of these reforms that he did, noble as they were, well-intentioned, serious and sincere for him, it just never took root in the heart of the nation at large. And so God says, they didn't turn to me with all their heart, but rather just in pretense or in deception, your translation might say. It wasn't a serious penitence. It was just this half-hearted, well, this is what the king says we have to do, so I guess we'll go along. All right. That's the climate into which Jeremiah begins his work. Josiah reigns for 31 years. So we did this math here. This is 18 years that these reforms are going on or in their beginning stages. Josiah pursues these things for 31 years until he meets his death, which we'll talk about on Sunday, how that happened. But Jeremiah and Josiah they're tight. Because Josiah is trying to lead the nation in the right way, and Jeremiah is on the sidelines cheering. The problem is nobody's listening to either one of them. Okay. I'm done. You guys got anything for me?
Was somebody advising Josiah when he was 8 to leave to field all this work?
Yes. It was not his father. Sandy, that was, I want to double check before I say this. I don't recall specific people mentioned, but that was a very normal thing. There's another king, Joash, when he becomes a king as a boy, and he's got an advisor named Jehoiada who worked along with him and essentially not only raised him, but taught him how to be a good king. So that was a very common thing because it wasn't unusual for children to ascend to the throne. Because conspiracies and assassinations, that was actually pretty commonplace in the ancient world. So children oftentimes ascended to the throne, and they had advisors around them who would help them.
And that likely accounts for his faith.
Oh, yeah.
The righteous advisor that he had versus
Yes.
he wasn't old enough to be like his father was.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, get lesson number 3 over here, and that will get you where you need to be for Sunday. Thank you.